The lecture hall on Kepler had seen its share of dramatic moments, explosive chemistry demonstrations, heated debates about dark matter theory, and that memorable incident where a Quartzian cadet accidentally shattered 3 windows during a resonance frequency experiment. But nothing quite prepared the assembled students for Commander Drakthus's weekly masterpiece, Xenobiology and Combat Assessment, better known among the cadets as How Not to Die Horribly When You Meet Other Species. Today's topic? Humans. The Galactic Defense Academy's most notorious instructor strode into the amphitheater with the confidence of someone who'd survived 3 different wars and lived to complain about the cafeteria food. Drakthus cut an imposing figure, 8 feet of scaled muscle with 4 arms that could multitask in ways that made human drill sergeants weep with envy. His reputation preceded him like a particularly intimidating shadow, and his combat record read like a greatest hits album of interstellar conflicts. "Settle down, you pathetic excuses for future officers." His voice boomed across the tiered seating, causing a Chitik cadet to reflexively click her mandibles in alarm. "Today, we discuss the most unpredictable, most dangerous, most absolutely insane species currently loose in civilized space." The holographic display behind him flickered to life, showing the familiar blue marble of Earth rotating slowly against the star-filled void. Several non-human cadets shifted uncomfortably in their specially designed seats. The humans in attendance, all 5 of them scattered throughout the 200-seat auditorium, continued taking notes with the kind of casual indifference that probably proved whatever point Drakthus was about to make. "Humans," he announced, as if the word itself carried some terrible curse. "Nature's own little joke on the concept of rational evolution." Chloe Bennett, seated 3 rows from the back between a nervous-looking Merhai and a Lumen, whose energy field kept flickering with what could charitably be called anxiety, glanced up from her tablet. She'd been sketching the room's layout, a habit that drove her psych professors crazy but had kept her alive during 2 peacekeeping missions. Her pen paused mid-stroke as she watched the commander's theatrical warm-up. "Now, I know what you're thinking," Drakthus continued, beginning his trademark pace across the front of the classroom. "You're thinking, Commander, humans don't look that threatening. They're small. They have no natural weapons. They can't even survive in space without life support." He paused for effect, letting his reptilian gaze sweep the audience. "And you would be catastrophically, spectacularly, dangerously wrong." The hologram shifted to display a montage of human conflicts throughout history. Ancient warriors clashing with bronze weapons, medieval knights charging into overwhelming odds, modern soldiers advancing through urban warfare, space, marines boarding hostile vessels in the void between stars. "Humans," Drakthus explained, with the enthusiasm of someone describing a particularly virulent plague, "are persistence predators. Do you know what that means, Cadet Brixnall?" The 9-foot Gorlaxian straightened in his reinforced seat, natural armor plates shifting with a sound like grinding stone. "Ah, they don't give up, sir." "Precisely. They don't give up, ever. When a human decides you need to die, your life expectancy drops faster than atmospheric pressure during hull breach." The commander's 4 hands moved in coordination, manipulating the holographic display to show pursuit scenarios. "They will chase you across star systems. They will hunt you through asteroid fields. They will follow you into hyperspace if necessary. And they will find a way to kill you with whatever happens to be lying around." A Chitik cadet raised one of her 4 arms. "But, sir, surely their lack of natural weaponry puts them at a disadvantage." Drakthus's laugh sounded like rocks tumbling down a mountainside. "Natural weaponry? Child, humans don't need natural weapons. They are natural weapons. They turn everything around them into weapons. Furniture becomes projectiles. Kitchen utensils become stabbing implements. They once killed an enemy using nothing but a writing instrument and what they call creative application of physics. Chloe made a note in her margin. Dramatic, much? She'd heard these stories before, usually from instructors who'd never actually worked alongside human units. The reality was both more and less impressive than the legend, but explaining that would probably ruin everyone's fun. Observe! Drakthus gestured grandly, and the hologram shifted to show various human military statistics. Survival rates, mission success percentages, casualty ratios, all the numbers that looked impressive when you stripped away context and nuance. In every major conflict of the last 2 centuries, human forces have maintained combat effectiveness even when outnumbered 20-1. They have a saying, "The difficult we do immediately, the impossible takes a little longer." The Merhai beside Chloe whispered something that sounded like nervous bubbling. She leaned over slightly. "He's cherry-picking data," she murmured. "Those statistics don't account for technological advantages or tactical support." Coralith's gill slits fluttered with what might have been relief. "You're not offended by this presentation?" "Oh, I'm taking notes," Chloe replied with a small smile. "Just not the kind he thinks I am." Meanwhile, Drakthus had moved on to psychological warfare. Humans possess an unsettling ability to compartmentalize trauma and continue functioning under extreme stress. They call this getting back on the horse, which makes no sense because horses are extinct on most civilized worlds, but the principle remains terrifying. The hologram now displayed brain scans, stress hormone, charts, and psychological profiles that looked more like horror movie advertisements than scientific data. They form pack bonds with other species, including former enemies, and will defend their adopted pack members with the same ferocity they show protecting their own young. This makes them simultaneously the most dangerous allies and the most lethal opponents you can encounter. Brixenal raised his hand again. "Sir, if they're so dangerous, why do we accept them into the Academy?" The question hung in the air like an unexploded torpedo. Every human in the room suddenly found themselves the focus of roughly 400 eyes, optical sensors, and various other detection organs. The silence stretched long enough to make even the lumen's energy field dim with discomfort. Drakthus's scaled features arranged themselves into what might have been a grin on a less intimidating face. "An excellent question, Cadet Brixenal. The answer is simple. Because if you can't beat them," he spread all 4 arms wide, "you'd better recruit them." The human military doctrine is based on a concept they call overwhelming response. When threatened, they don't just defend, they escalate until the threat no longer exists. This tendency has led to some of the most decisive victories in galactic history, and some of the most creative applications of antimatter ever recorded. A Quartzian cadet's crystalline structure chimed softly, their species equivalent of nervous laughter. "Surely that's an exaggeration, Commander." "Is it?" Drakthus manipulated the hologram again, showing footage from the Battle of Titan's Ring. During this engagement, human forces found themselves trapped in an asteroid field with enemy vessels on all sides. Their response? They turned the asteroids into kinetic weapons by using their ship's gravity drives to accelerate chunks of rock to relativistic speeds. The engagement lasted 6 minutes. The cleanup took 2 years. Chloe had to admit that one was actually pretty accurate. She'd written part of the after-action report. "But here's what makes humans truly dangerous," the commander continued, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was an ominous whisper, but came out more like a theatrical stage hiss. "They don't think like us, they don't fight like us, they don't even define victory and defeat the same way we do." The hologram shifted to show various alien species in combat scenarios, methodical, predictable, following established patterns of warfare that had worked for millennia. When a Gorlaxian fights, he relies on natural armor and superior strength. When a Velkari fights, we use speed and coordination between multiple limbs. When a Cheetic fights, they employ swarm tactics and overwhelming numbers. Each species nodded as their combat doctrine was described. Humans? Humans ask themselves, what would the enemy never expect? And then they do that. They have turned retreat into victory, surrender into ambush, and peace negotiations into tactical advantages. There is no established pattern to human warfare because they refuse to establish patterns. Every engagement is unique, every strategy is improvised, and every victory is achieved through methods that violate every known principle of civilized combat. The room had grown quiet except for the soft sounds of note-taking and occasional nervous shifting. Even the humans were paying attention now, though Chloe noticed Marcus Webb rolling his eyes at some of the more dramatic descriptions. "This is why," Drakthis announced, building toward his traditional crescendo. "You must learn to recognize the signs of human aggression before it's too late. You must understand their behavioral patterns, their psychological triggers, and their tactical preferences." He gestured toward the holographic display one final time. "Tomorrow, we will conduct practical exercises in human threat assessment. You will learn to identify dangerous humans in social situations, recognize the warning signs of impending violence, and execute proper defensive protocols." The commander's 4 hands moved in perfect coordination as he shut down the hologram and gathered his teaching materials. "Until then, I suggest you review Chapter 12 of your textbooks. Why running away is often the smartest option." As cadets began filing out of the lecture hall, their conversations a mixture of nervous excitement and genuine worry, Chloe remained in her seat, adding final details to her sketch of the room. She'd noted sight lines, exit routes, and optimal positions for addressing a large group. Old habits from her military psychology training: always assess the tactical situation, even in a classroom. The Merhai beside her lingered as well, her aquatic features reflecting the overhead lighting. "That was intense," Coralith said, her voice carrying the slight burbling quality of her species. "It was certainly something," Chloe agreed, closing her tablet. "Though I'm curious about those practical exercises he mentioned. You're not concerned about being studied, analyzed for threatening behavior?" Chloe stood, slinging her bag over her shoulder with practiced ease. "Oh, I think it'll be educational for everyone involved." As they walked toward the exit, Coralith glanced at her human classmate with something approaching concern. "You have a strange smile when you say that." "Do I?" Chloe's expression remained perfectly neutral, but there was something in her eyes, a hint of anticipation perhaps, or professional interest. I hadn't noticed. Behind them, Commander Drakthis was reviewing his lesson plan for the next day's practical demonstration. He'd been teaching this course for 8 years, and tomorrow's exercise was always his favorite part. There was nothing quite like watching cadets fumble through threat assessment protocols while he role-played various aggressive scenarios. It never occurred to him that this year, for the first time, he wouldn't be the only one in the room who actually understood how humans fought. That oversight would prove educational. The next day arrived with the kind of artificial sunrise that made living on a moon feel like an elaborate theater production. Kepler 6b's primary star cast long shadows through the Academy's reinforced windows, and the lecture hall buzzed with the nervous energy of cadets who'd spent the previous evening reading about human combat psychology until their various optical organs hurt. Commander Drakthis strode in precisely on time, his forearms carrying an assortment of training equipment that looked suspiciously like it had been designed by someone who'd watched too many action holovids. Padded armor, practice weapons, and what appeared to be a portable holographic projector that probably cost more than most cadets' annual stipends. Today, he announced with the theatrical flair that had made him either beloved or insufferable depending on your tolerance for drama, we move beyond theory into practical application. You will learn to identify and respond to human behavioral threats in real-time scenarios. The assembled students, a mixture of species that looked like the galaxy's most diverse support group, shifted in their seats with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Brixnal, the armored Gorlaxian, cracked his knuckles with sounds like breaking concrete. Several Chitic cadets clicked their mandibles in what passed for anticipation among their kind. The lumen known as Lumen 99 flickered slightly brighter, their energy field pulsing with curiosity. And in her usual spot, 3 rows from the back, Chloe Bennett sat with her tablet open, stylus moving in small, precise strokes, as she continued her habit of mapping everything around her. Today's sketch included detailed notes about each species' physical capabilities and behavioral patterns. Research, she told herself. Definitely research. Volunteer! Drakthis barked suddenly, causing a merhai to emit a startled bubble stream. I need someone brave enough to face simulated human aggression. Every non-human hand, claw, tentacle, and energy tendril in the room shot up immediately. The enthusiasm was almost touching, if you ignored the fact that they were volunteering to practice fighting members of Chloe's species. Cadet Brixnul! The commander's choice was predictable. The Gorlaxian had been practically vibrating with eagerness since entering the room. Your natural armor makes you an excellent candidate for this exercise. Brixnal lumbered to the front of the classroom with the confidence of someone who'd never met a problem that couldn't be solved by being larger and more heavily armored than it. At 9 feet tall with natural plating that could deflect small arms fire, he was exactly the kind of student who benefited from a reality check. Unfortunately, today's reality check was going to be more educational than anyone anticipated. The scenario, Drakthis explained as he activated his holographic projector, is a diplomatic reception where tensions are running high. You will play the role of a security officer tasked with identifying potential human threats before they escalate to violence. The hologram shimmered into existence around them, transforming the lecture hall into a convincing replica of an embassy ballroom. Virtual guests in formal attire mingled in small groups, their conversations a low murmur of diplomatic pleasantries and barely concealed political maneuvering. Your objectives are simple, the commander continued, beginning to circle Brixnal like a predator sizing up prey. Identify suspicious human behavior, assess the threat level, and execute appropriate defensive protocols. Are you ready? Ready, sir! Brixnal's voice boomed with the kind of confidence that usually preceded spectacular failures in military training scenarios. Excellent. Initiating simulation. Now. What followed was perhaps the most unintentionally comedic display of human behavior ever witnessed in an academic setting. Commander Drakthis, clearly drawing his understanding of human aggression from the same holovids that had inspired his equipment choices, began what could charitably be described as method acting, and it was terrible. "Greetings, fellow diplomatic personages," he announced in a voice that suggested he'd learned human speech patterns from a malfunctioning translation matrix. "I am definitely a normal human attending this peaceful gathering." Several cadets began taking notes. Chloe put down her stylus and watched with the kind of fascination usually reserved for natural disasters. Drakthus continued his performance, stomping around the holographic ballroom with all the subtlety of a cargo hauler attempting ballet. "I am experiencing human emotions such as anger and territorial aggression. Observe my threatening posture." He spread all four arms wide, which, admittedly, would be threatening if humans possessed four arms, and began making what he apparently believed were menacing facial expressions. The effect was somewhere between intimidating and deeply disturbing, like watching a nature documentary about apex predators directed by someone who'd never seen an animal. "Cadet Brixnull," the commander called without breaking character, "what threatening behaviors do you observe?" The Gorlaxian studied the display with the serious attention of someone who genuinely believed this might save his life someday. "The subject is displaying aggressive body language and making direct eye contact while vocalizing threats?" "Correct. And what is your response protocol?" "Maintain defensive distance, attempt verbal de-escalation, and prepare for physical confrontation if necessary." "Outstanding! Now observe as I demonstrate escalating human aggression." What followed was a masterclass in how not to portray human behavior. Drakthus began pacing in exaggerated circles, occasionally stopping to gesture dramatically at imaginary opponents. His threatening vocalizations sounded more like someone practicing for amateur theater than genuine aggression, and his movement patterns followed the kind of predictable routine that would get any actual combatant killed within seconds. The non-human cadets watched with rapt attention, scribbling notes and occasionally murmuring to each other about classic human threat displays and typical territorial behavior. It was like watching a nature documentary where all the scientists had somehow confused humans with a completely different species. Chloe endured about 5 minutes of this performance art before her professional instincts finally overrode her sense of politeness. She raised her hand. The effect was immediate and profound. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as every eye in the room swiveled toward her with the kind of synchronized precision usually seen in military formations. The sudden silence was so complete that the hum of the room's environmental systems became audible. Commander Drakthus froze mid-gesture, one arm raised in what he'd probably intended as a menacing pose, but now looked more like someone hailing a taxi. His reptilian features arranged themselves into an expression of confusion that somehow managed to be visible across species lines. "Yes, Cadet Bennett?" His voice carried the tone of someone who'd just realized their carefully choreographed performance had hit an unexpected snag. Chloe stood with the kind of fluid, economical movement that suggested years of military training. As she rose, something about the room's atmosphere changed. A subtle shift that most of the cadets couldn't identify but definitely felt. "Sir, I was wondering if I could provide some feedback on the demonstration." The words were polite, professional, and delivered with exactly the kind of respectful tone that military academies spent years drilling into their students. But somehow, the simple act of standing had transformed the entire dynamic of the room. It wasn't anything dramatic. No sudden movements, no aggressive postures, no threatening gestures. If anything, Chloe appeared more relaxed than she had during the previous day's lecture. But every non-human in the room suddenly found themselves hyper-aware of her presence in ways they couldn't quite explain. Drakthus, caught completely off guard by the polite interruption to his carefully planned lesson, found himself nodding before his brain had fully processed the request. Yes, of course. What kind of feedback did you have in mind? Well, sir, I think your demonstration shows what humans might look like in Hollywood productions, but it's not really how we behave when we're actually being threatening. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Not literally, the environmental systems maintained their steady output, but something in Chloe's tone carried implications that made several cadets suddenly wish they were elsewhere. I see, Drakthis said slowly, his forearms lowering to his sides. And what would you say is inaccurate about my portrayal? Chloe began walking toward the front of the classroom with the same easy confidence she'd shown when standing. Her path was direct, but not hurried, purposeful, but not aggressive. It was the kind of movement that somehow demanded attention without seeming to try. Real human threats don't announce themselves, sir. We don't pace around making dramatic gestures or vocalizing our intentions. When humans are actually dangerous. She paused at the edge of the holographic simulation, close enough to Brixnell that the massive Gorlaxian had to look down to meet her eyes. We get very, very quiet. The silence that followed her words was the kind that made everyone suddenly aware of their own heartbeats. Lum N-99's energy field dimmed to almost nothing. Coralith's gill slits fluttered nervously. Even Prismdoc's crystalline structure seemed to resonate at a lower frequency. And Brixnell, 9 feet of natural armor and predatory confidence, took an involuntary step backward. Chloe smiled. Not the warm, friendly expression she'd worn during previous interactions, but something smaller and far more unsettling. Would you like me to show you what I mean? Commander Drakthis found himself in the peculiar position of having completely lost control of his own classroom without anyone raising their voice or making any overtly threatening gestures. The human cadet standing in his holographic simulation looked exactly the same as she had moments before. Same height, same build, same unremarkable human features. But somehow, everything had changed. He began, then stopped, as his instructor instincts warred with a sudden, inexplicable conviction that agreeing to this demonstration might be the worst decision he'd made since volunteering for combat duty in the Proxima Nebula. It would be educational, Chloe added helpfully. The word educational had never sounded quite so ominous before. Around the room, 200 cadets held their collective breath as they waited to see whether their instructor would accept the challenge from the small human who had somehow managed to become the most dangerous thing in the room without moving more than 20 feet. Commander Drakthis, veteran of 3 wars and survivor of more combat engagements than most cadets would see in their entire careers, looked into Chloe Bennett's calm, professional eyes and realized he was about to receive an education he hadn't planned on. "Very well, Cadet Bennett," he said, his voice carrying only the slightest tremor. "Please proceed with your demonstration." As Chloe's smile widened just a fraction, every non-human in the room simultaneously understood why their species had developed such elaborate protocols for dealing with humanity. They were about to learn that all those protocols were inadequate. The holographic ballroom seemed suddenly smaller with Chloe standing at its center. She moved with deliberate calm toward Brixnell, who, despite his impressive size and natural armor, appeared to be reconsidering every life choice that had led him to this moment. "The first thing you need to understand," Chloe began, her voice carrying the kind of casual authority that turned statements into lectures without any change in volume, is that real human assessment doesn't happen like a performance. It happens in the background, constantly, while we're doing other things?" She gestured toward the holographic crowd around them. Commander Drakthus's demonstration assumes humans telegraph their intentions. But when we're actually evaluating threats, you won't know we're doing it. Brixnell shifted his weight, a movement that would have been insignificant under normal circumstances, but now seemed to echo through the silent room. "But surely there are observable behaviors." "Oh, absolutely," Chloe interrupted, with that same unsettling smile. "For instance, I've been cataloging everyone in this room since I walked in yesterday. Would you like me to share my observations?" The question hung in the air like an unexploded ordnance. Around the amphitheater, 200 cadets suddenly felt very exposed. "When I first entered this classroom," she continued without waiting for an answer, "I noted 3 exit routes, identified which seats offered the best tactical positioning, and began compiling psychological profiles on my classmates based on their species' documented behavioral patterns." She turned slowly, her gaze sweeping across the assembled students. Chitik respond to swarm coordination, so Cathara automatically positions herself where she can see the maximum number of her classmates. Gorlaxians rely on physical intimidation, which is why Brixnall chose a seat in the front row, where his size would be most noticeable. Merhai prefer tactical observation, explaining Corallith's preference for elevated seating with clear sight lines. Each species mentioned seemed to shrink slightly, as their basic instincts were dissected with clinical precision. Lumens avoid energy interference, so Lumien 99 maintains specific distances from electronic equipment. Quartzians require harmonic stability, which is why Prismdoc sits in corners where architectural acoustics are most predictable. Commander Drakthus found his voice. "And the humans?" "Marcus sits near the back left, because it's closest to the auxiliary exit. Military engineers always plan escape routes. Danny chose her position based on optimal angles for observing instructor movement patterns. Tactical specialists never stop analyzing." "And you?" Chloe's expression didn't change, but something in her posture suggested amusement. "I sit where I can see everyone else without appearing to watch them. Psychology 101. The admission sent a collective chill through the room. Every cadet suddenly remembered interactions with their human classmates, wondering what had been observed, catalogued, and filed away for future reference. "This brings us to Lesson 2, Chloe continued, turning back to Brixnall. "Humans don't just assess current threats, we anticipate future ones. Brixnall, may I use you for a practical demonstration?" The Gorlaxian's natural armor plates shifted nervously. "I suppose? Excellent. What I'm about to do is a basic human threat assessment. I'll explain each step as I perform it, so everyone can understand the process." She began walking slowly around Brixnall, her movement casual but purposeful. Step 1. Identify physical advantages and disadvantages. Brixnall has significant size and strength advantages, plus natural armor that would deflect most conventional weapons. Her circuit continued, each step deliberate. However, his armor has flexibility joints at the shoulders, hips, and neck, necessary for movement but representing structural weak points. His center of gravity is high due to his height, making him vulnerable to leverage-based attacks. Brixnall stood very still, as if moving might somehow make the analysis worse. Step 2. Assess psychological state and likely responses. Gorlaxians are aggressive combatants who rely on intimidation and direct confrontation. When threatened, Brixnall will likely attempt to use his size advantage through grappling or charging attacks. She paused directly in front of him, looking up at his face with professional interest. His current stress indicators, dilated pupils, increased respiration, slight tremor in his lower left arm, suggest he's already in pre-combat arousal. That's actually disadvantageous in close quarters. How is increased combat readiness disadvantageous? Cathara's voice carried the clicking undertones that indicated confused agitation among her species. Because adrenaline decreases fine motor control and reduces tactical flexibility, an opponent in combat arousal becomes predictable. Chloe stepped to Brixenal's left side. Step 3. Environmental assessment. This room has multiple potential weapons: chairs that could serve as clubs or shields, electronic equipment that could be improvised into projectiles, and a holographic projector with exposed power conduits. She gestured toward various objects around the room, and suddenly every piece of furniture looked vaguely sinister. The flooring provides good traction for lateral movement, but might be slippery for species with different locomotion systems. The ceiling height allows for vertical maneuvering if necessary, and the tiered seating creates multiple elevation advantages. Commander Drakthus watched this casual inventory of his classroom's lethal potential with growing unease. Cadet Bennett, exactly what kind of training have you received? Standard military psychology certification, sir. This is basic situational awareness that any human soldier learns in Week 3 of combat training. The implications of that statement settled over the room like a heavy blanket. If this was basic training, what did advanced human military doctrine look like? Step 4, Chloe continued, is tactical planning. Based on my assessment, engaging Brixenal in direct combat would be inadvisable due to his physical advantages. However, humans rarely engage in direct combat when alternatives exist. She moved to his right side, her position shifting with fluid precision. Option 1. Use his high center of gravity against him. A low tackle or leg sweep would likely succeed, especially if combined with his current psychological state. Brixenal's breathing became noticeably more labored. Option 2. Exploit armor joint vulnerabilities. Gorlaxian plate armor is impressive, but creates blind spots during movement. A strike to the shoulder joint would limit his combat effectiveness significantly. Option 3. Environmental advantages. The classroom's layout favors mobility over strength. I could use elevation, furniture obstacles, and confined spaces to negate his size advantage. She completed her circuit and stood facing him again. Of course, the optimal strategy would be to avoid physical confrontation entirely through psychological manipulation. What kind of psychological manipulation? The question came from Lumien 99, whose energy field was now barely visible. Well, for example, everything I just described has likely increased Brixenal's stress levels to the point where his combat effectiveness is actually lower than when we started. He's been standing in a ready position for the last 3 minutes, which is exhausting for someone his size. His breathing is shallow, his muscles are tense, and he's focused so intently on potential threats that he's developed tunnel vision. Every word was delivered with the same calm, educational tone, as if she were discussing weather patterns instead of psychological warfare. More importantly, by demonstrating that I've analyzed his capabilities in detail, I've introduced doubt into his tactical confidence. He's now wondering what else I've observed, what other plans I might have, and whether his usual combat strategies would be effective. Brixenal's massive frame seemed to deflate slightly as each psychological tactic was explained. The beauty of this approach, Chloe added, with what was definitely not a reassuring smile, is that it works on any species. Fear and uncertainty are universal concepts. The room had grown so quiet that the ambient hum of life support systems sounded like rushing wind. Every cadet sat frozen, suddenly aware that they'd been receiving a masterclass in applied psychological warfare disguised as an educational demonstration. Commander Drakthis realized he needed to regain control of the situation before his classroom became a therapy session for traumatized students. That's very informative, Cadet Bennett. But surely actual combat involves more than psychological manipulation. Oh, absolutely, sir. Would you like me to demonstrate the physical applications? The question was asked with the same polite professionalism that had characterized her entire presentation, but something in the way she said it made every instructor instinct Drakthis possessed scream warnings. I think that might be. It would be very educational, she interrupted gently. After all, your curriculum emphasizes practical learning experiences. Drakthis found himself trapped by his own teaching philosophy. He'd spent years emphasizing hands-on learning, practical demonstrations, and real-world applications. Declining now would undermine everything he'd built his reputation on. Very well, he said, his forearms spreading in a gesture that was probably meant to look confident, but came across more like someone preparing for impact. But we'll keep it to basic defensive techniques. Chloe's smile widened just enough to be noticeable. Of course, sir. Just basic techniques. She gestured for him to approach, and Commander Drakthis, veteran of 3 wars, survivor of the Battle of Titan's Ring, and the Galactic Defense Academy's most feared combat instructor, walked toward a small human woman and wondered when exactly he'd lost control of his own life. Now, the key thing to understand about human combat doctrine, Chloe explained as he approached, is that we don't fight fair. We fight smart. Drakthis took a ready position, his forearms providing him with significant reach and grappling advantages. His natural speed and coordination had won him numerous combat certifications across multiple disciplines. When you're ready, sir, Chloe said, assuming what looked like a completely relaxed stance. Drakthis lunged forward with the kind of coordinated 4-limb attack that had overwhelmed opponents throughout his military career. It was textbook Velkari combat technique, fast, precise, and absolutely devastating when properly executed. 3 seconds later, he was on the ground. He wasn't entirely sure how it had happened. One moment, he'd been executing a perfect grappling maneuver, and the next he was staring at the ceiling while his nervous system tried to process what felt like a small earthquake, followed by a very localized gravitational anomaly. Chloe stood over him, offering her hand with the same friendly expression she'd worn when asking questions about classroom logistics. The thing about fighting smart, she explained as she helped him to his feet, is that it doesn't matter how many arms you have if you can't control your momentum. Around the room, 200 cadets sat in absolute silence as their legendary combat instructor was assisted to his feet by the human who had just redefined their understanding of military capability. Commander Drakthis stood up slowly, his professional dignity somewhat bruised, but his respect for human military doctrine significantly enhanced. That was informative. Just basic human defensive techniques, sir, Chloe replied modestly. Like I said, we're taught this in week 3. As she walked back toward her seat, every eye in the room tracked her movement with the kind of attention usually reserved for unexploded ordnance. The casual way she'd dismantled their instructor's attack, without apparent effort or malice, had transformed their entire understanding of what threat assessment actually meant. Brixnell looked down at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. I need to reconsider my major, he mumbled. Several other cadets nodded in agreement. Commander Drakthis straightened his uniform and tried to salvage what remained of his lesson plan. But the damage was done. His carefully constructed curriculum about human behavioral threats had just been replaced by a practical demonstration that made every previous lesson look like children's games. In the space of 20 minutes, Cadet Chloe Bennett had turned his classroom into her classroom, his students into her audience, and his expertise into a footnote. And she'd done it all with a smile. The silence that followed Chloe's return to her seat was the kind that made everyone suddenly aware of their own breathing. 200 cadets sat motionless, processing what they'd just witnessed with the shell-shocked expression of people whose fundamental assumptions about reality had just been casually demolished. Commander Dracathis stood at the front of his classroom, 4 arms hanging at his sides, staring at the small human who had just transformed his legendary combat reputation into an educational footnote. His carefully planned curriculum lay in ruins around him like the aftermath of a particularly thorough military exercise. "Well," he said finally, his voice carrying the tone of someone who just discovered that everything he thought he knew was wrong. "That was illuminating." Brixenol raised one massive hand with the tentative gesture of someone who wasn't entirely sure he wanted to ask his question. "Commander, if what we just saw represents basic human defensive techniques, what do their actual combat specialists look like?" The question hung in the air like an ominous prophecy. Around the room, cadets began exchanging glances that suggested they were reconsidering their career choices in galactic defense. "That," Dracathis admitted with the honesty of someone whose pride had already taken maximum damage, "is a terrifying question that I'm no longer qualified to answer." Chloe looked up from her tablet, where she'd been sketching throughout the demonstration. "Actually, sir, I think you've been asking the wrong questions." Every head in the room swiveled toward her with synchronized precision that would have been impressive if it hadn't been driven by collective anxiety. "Instead of focusing on how to fight humans," she continued, with the same calm professionalism that had characterized her entire presentation, "maybe the curriculum should emphasize how to work with us effectively." Keth Ara's mandibles clicked nervously. "What do you mean?" "Well, everything Commander Dracathis taught you about human capabilities is essentially accurate. We are persistent, adaptive, and tactically unpredictable. But those same traits that make us dangerous enemies also make us extremely effective allies." She stood again, and this time the room's reaction was notably different. Instead of the predatory stillness that had accompanied her previous demonstrations, her movement now carried a different quality: less threat assessment, more invitation to dialogue. "The human military doctrine you've been learning about isn't designed for conquest or intimidation. It's designed for protection. Everything I just showed you, the situational awareness, the tactical planning, the psychological analysis, those skills exist because humans will do anything to protect the people we consider part of our pack." Coralith's gill slits fluttered with cautious curiosity. Pack? Family? Friends? Allies? Fellow soldiers? The specific relationship doesn't matter. Once humans decide you're worth protecting, we'll use every dirty trick, creative strategy, and improvised weapon in the galaxy to keep you safe. The atmosphere in the room began to shift as cadets processed this perspective. Fear was slowly being replaced by something approaching fascination. "The Battle of Titan's Ring that Commander Dracathis mentioned earlier," Chloe gestured toward the holographic display that still showed fragments of the previous day's lesson. "Human forces didn't turn asteroids into kinetic weapons because they enjoyed destruction. They did it because 3 Allied vessels with mixed-species crews were trapped in that field, and the human commanders decided those crews were worth saving." Lum N99's energy field brightened slightly. The entire engagement was a rescue operation. Every human military action is ultimately about protecting something, Chloe confirmed. We don't fight because we like violence. We fight because we're very, very good at it, and sometimes that's what protection requires. Commander Drakthus found himself nodding slowly as pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place. The psychological profiles, the tactical assessments, the constant vigilance. It's all defensive in nature. Exactly. When I analyzed everyone in this room, I wasn't planning attacks. I was identifying potential threats to my classmates and figuring out how to neutralize them if necessary. Brixenel's armored plates shifted as he straightened. You were protecting us? From day one, Chloe confirmed with a smile that was genuinely warm for the first time since her demonstration began. It's what humans do. We can't help ourselves. The admission sparked a wave of whispered conversations throughout the amphitheater as cadets began recontextualizing every interaction they'd had with their human classmates. This brings me to my real point, Chloe continued, raising her voice slightly to regain attention. Commander Drakthus, your curriculum treats humans like a problem to be solved, rather than allies to be understood. But the galaxy's security challenges aren't going to be resolved through better threat assessment protocols. She gestured toward the diverse assembly of species around them. They're going to be solved through cooperation between species who understand each other's strengths and trust each other's motivations. Drakthus considered this, his reptilian features arranging themselves into an expression of thoughtful concentration. What would you suggest? Joint training exercises, mixed species tactical planning sessions, cooperative problem-solving scenarios. Chloe's voice carried the enthusiasm of someone discussing a fascinating research project. Instead of teaching aliens how to fight humans, teach everyone how to fight alongside humans. The suggestion sparked immediate interest throughout the room. Cadets began sitting up straighter, their body language shifting from defensive anxiety to engaged curiosity. And, Chloe added, with a mischievous glint in her eyes, full disclosure, I'm not actually a standard military cadet. The room went silent again, but this time with anticipation rather than fear. I'm a military psychologist specializing in interspecies cooperation. My assignment here is to study how different species perceive human capabilities and develop training protocols that improve joint operational effectiveness. Commander Drakthus stared at her for a long moment, then began to laugh, a sound like grinding stone that somehow managed to convey genuine amusement rather than menace. You've been conducting research on us this entire time. From day one, she confirmed cheerfully. Though I have to admit, your theatrical teaching style provided more data than I expected. And your recommendations? Scrap the current curriculum. Replace human threat assessment with interspecies tactical cooperation. Focus on building trust and understanding rather than fear and defensive protocols. She looked around the room at faces that had transformed from anxiety to genuine interest. The most dangerous thing about humans isn't our capacity for violence. It's our ability to turn former enemies into family. Once we decide you're worth protecting, we'll move mountains to keep you safe. And how do we earn that protection? Prism Doc's crystalline voice carried harmonics of genuine curiosity. Chloe's smile was radiant. Just ask. Humans have never been particularly good at saying no to people who need help. As cadets began filing out of the lecture hall, their conversations buzzing with new possibilities rather than fearful speculation, Commander Drakthus approached Chloe's desk. Your research, he said, extending one of his forehands in the Velkari gesture of professional respect. When will you publish your findings? Actually, Chloe replied, accepting the gesture with both hands in the human tradition, I was hoping you might consider co-authoring the paper. Your insights into alien psychology would be invaluable. As they shook hands, a simple gesture that somehow represented the beginning of something entirely new, cadets throughout the room began approaching their human classmates with questions about cooperation rather than concerns about threat assessment. The Galactic Defense Academy's most notorious course had just become its most hopeful.